So with coal plants like Boardman, why is it so bad, the stuff that's coming out of there?
Pollution comes from coal from cradle to grave. So what I mean by that is when coal is mined and it's extracted in places like the coal we burn here in the Northwest, it comes from the Powder River Basin of Montana and Wyoming. So when you mine it, there's impacts to water and fugitive dust that comes from mining it and extracting it. It gets transported here. That coal is not covered. The coal trains are not covered, so you lose coal along the way. It can go into waterways. If there's a derailment, that can be a huge problem. And then, of course, when it's burned, there's tremendous levels of pollution that come from that. So the Boardman plant, as an example, when we're burning the coal there, it releases nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide. And those are two major pollutants that contribute to haze. And they also contribute to significant cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses. So like heart disease, asthma, those kinds of illnesses, in large part can be traced back to coal pollution for many people's health if they're living in proximity to it. And that's one of the biggest concerns we have with the impacts of air pollution as one example. And then there's also the climate impacts of coal. It's one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions that contributes to climate change. And then you also have the coal waste. So when you're done burning it, there's a waste product, coal ash, that contains a lot of heavy metals that can contaminate groundwater. And of course, human exposure to it is a big problem. Mercury emissions are also an issue. So that's, when you burn coal, it also releases mercury that goes up into the atmosphere. When it rains, it comes down into our water sources, goes up through the food chain. So every time you're eating fish, you might be consuming some level of mercury, which of course is more impactful for populations who eat a lot of fish for cultural or recreation purposes.
That all sounds bad, but when you look at the stack, it's just like a lot of white steam coming out of there.
Well, that's actually, when you think about the pollution that you can't see, that's the most harmful because those are those very fine particulates. So the particulate matter that's also coming from burning is the stuff that can get deep into your lungs and into your bloodstream that causes those cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses. So the clouds might seem fine coming out of it, but they're actually containing some pretty significant pollutants that can harm people's health.
Okay, interesting. So one little factoid that I picked off the internet, the International Energy Agency says that coal counted for something like 10 gigatons of carbon released in 2018. The Boardman plant is only like 1 million. Isn't that just a drop in the ocean?
Well, you might think about a drop in the ocean, but the ocean is comprised of drops, right? And so when you think about the entirety of the nation's coal fleet, it's pretty significant to have the only coal plant that exists in Oregon to be coming offline. That's sending a huge signal, and especially since the Boardman plant isn't necessarily a coal plant that was built in 1950. There's some really old power plants out there. Boardman is a younger power plant, and it was shown that it was more economic to retire it earlier, even with installing some pollution controls, and showing that it's the best way we can take care of the pollution coming from Boardman is to have a planful retirement for that plant. And I think the signal that it sends around, this plant was the largest source of climate pollution, the largest single source of climate pollution and air pollution in Oregon. And so the fact that we're going to be moving past that and hopefully accounting for the change that's going to be coming with that for the community is a pretty big deal.
But is it symbolic, or will it really make a difference?
Well, I think given this timeline that we have to solve climate change, every little bit counts. And we also need to be demonstrating that there are large regions that are able to go to clean energy and storage. And that's what we're seeing with Portland General Electric's most recent plan. They have more plans for incorporating clean energy and storage and doing some short-term market purchases of power to account for that instead of building a significant new source of carbon pollution like a gas plant. There's still some work we have to do in Oregon, of course. We still get over 32% of our electricity from burning coal out of state. And there are still proposals like the Jordan Cove liquefied natural gas facility that's proposed that if we really want to take climate change seriously and have Oregon be a leader on climate, we need to be taking steps like that and making sure that we're not making the problem worse. But also, I think it shows that there's the potential to have really great solutions for this. We're seeing creative policies coming forth like the Portland Clean Energy Fund that is going to be creating good family wage jobs while addressing climate. And I think that we need Oregon leadership to help drive those kinds of solutions to make sure we can continue to put more drops in the bucket, because it's certainly not a small one. It sends a huge signal. So it's iconic in that way, but also we need to be doing everything we can to be moving past it.
Would it be, if you were able to snap your fingers, would you have all the coal plants shut down in the U.S.?
I think that the science of climate and the pollution impacts that many people are facing from coal plants is significant, that we do need to be phasing out our country's coal fleet. But we also, I think we need to be looking at how we plan ahead around that. The changes that's happening is not easy for communities. We see these coal companies going bankrupt, like Black Jewel, that laid off 700 workers basically overnight. And we're seeing clean energy outpricing coal. It's no longer economic. And so we shouldn't be shutting down plants overnight. We need to be planning ahead for it so that communities can make their plans ahead for it, so that we can be accounting for the impacts it is going to have on workers. And it's not an easy problem to solve, and I'm not claiming it will be an easy problem to solve, but I think the more we can plan ahead, the more utilities are taking that change seriously and looking at the economics, looking at how more customers are demanding clean energy, and really working with regulators to say, let's have a planful and thoughtful transition before we see an economic downturn that's going to make it necessary for a company to turn off a plant on short notice.
Do you think the era of coal is coming to an end?
I think it is, and I think it has to. We're seeing, another good example is the Colstrip power plant in Montana. There are 4 units to that large power plant, and 2 of them were supposed to retire a few years from now, and now they'll be retiring at the end of this year because they were too expensive to operate. And so I think that speaks to the economics of coal shifting. It doesn't mean that that's going to be inevitable. However, there are certainly still plants that either the utility companies want to keep running them longer, or there's looking at subsidizing them in more ways than we have been subsidizing with our health over time. And we need to be making different choices if we're really going to be having a thoughtful shift from that source of energy.
Does it drive you crazy that Asia is still building coal plants and bringing more online and using more and more?
Well, China was outpacing the U.S. in clean energy development for a long time. I'm not quite sure where they're at today, but I think that we are also seeing a global movement to move off of coal-fired power and fossil fuels generally. So, you can look at where there are certainly these massive proposals in places like India and China, and yet we're also seeing responses, significant responses from the public, protests in Beijing around air quality. We're seeing incredible organizing coming out of rural communities in India where people have been displaced from some of these coal plant proposals. And frankly, we have a responsibility in the US to take care of the problem that we're putting forward globally around our sources of pollution, but also entities like the US Export-Import Bank or representatives of the World Bank financing some of these massive coal-fired power plants in other places like South Africa and India and China. And we've seen many of them get delayed. There's a major power plant in Kosovo that has been proposed for 10 years and is still not built yet. And so as we see clean energy continuing to become much more economic than these facilities, I think hopefully we'll be moving toward that cleaner energy future where we can have ideally good family wage jobs.
So it almost sounds like economics are driving them out more than the desire to clean up the environment.
It's definitely a recent phenomenon, I think, to be seeing the clean energy outpricing coal in the way that it is. And we have to remember that we've been helping to pay for coal for a long time through, investments in the railroads and in the ways that we have been impacted through externalities, the way that we have been affected with our public health from the pollution from coal. And that coal companies have been leasing federal land to mine coal for pennies on the dollar over time. So, finally we're seeing the economics, we're seeing a more level playing field than we have before. But also this wouldn't change, the change wouldn't be happening lightly. I mean, we have an administration that's trying to invest a lot more in the coal industry despite that downturn. And so without this strong public voice saying we want something different, we want to see clean energy investments, we want to see healthier air, clean water in our communities, And we want to see better benefits for workers and make sure that that clean energy economy is actually living wage jobs, ideally union jobs that are helping to support the next phase of our electricity generation.
Okay. And was this a top priority for the Sierra Club?
Absolutely. I think when we looked at the initially seen in the Bush-Cheney years when there was over 200 new coal-fired power plants being proposed, and we thought if there's any hope of addressing climate change, these 200 plus power plants can't get built. And fortunately, organizing with our allies around the country said we're going to fight every single one, and most of them have not been built. And so all of the claims from utility companies that the lights would go out if we didn't build all these new power plants, well, we see that did not come to pass. And I think now we're definitely taking on coal as a centerpiece in addressing climate change because it is one of the single largest sources of climate pollution and the significant impacts of the other co-pollutants that come with it. Now it also makes more economic sense given all of those things together. It's time.
And do you feel any responsibility for the workers who are going to lose their jobs?
It's a really significant concern, and that's something that we don't take lightly. And we also, I think, are trying to make the case that change is happening, and we have to be planful around it. And so it's important that companies are taking care of their workers and thinking and planning ahead around being transparent about what the future operations of a facility are. That's why we're encouraging Pacific Power to really think about a planful phase out of their coal fleet so that it isn't taking workers by surprise. It's certainly necessary, and that change is going to happen. I can't say what's best for those communities. They need to be able to define it for themselves and figure out how that change can be most eased. And we've seen some good examples of how that's happen in other places where we see investments from the companies back into the community to do new economic development or to help with worker transition, retraining, or to offer better retirement packages. We've also seen some examples of utilities committing funds up front for the transition that will happen and setting up conversations for how that funding can be used to help with that change. So hopefully we can see more settings where that is being defined by the community and figuring out how is this going to be, how can there be an adaptation that works.
Why is it so bad to have the Boardman coal-fired plant? What's wrong with that place?
Well, there's a significant amount of pollution that comes from Boardman, and so that power plant is the single largest source of climate pollution in the state. It also is the single largest source of haze that impacts air quality in Oregon. So sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide are pollutants that can contribute to cardiovascular and respiratory health issues. And it also contributes to mercury pollution, which can get into the food chain, and we eat in fish. So those are some significant issues with it. The haze that also comes from the plant, the pollution that comes from burning the coal also contributes to acid rain, which is having an impact on natural and cultural resources in the state. So when Boardman comes offline, that pollution will no longer be around. And when the plans for retirement came into effect, PGE was also required to install a certain level of pollution controls. So some of that haze was cut during the interim over the past 9 years. But now we will see that largest source of pollution being eliminated.
Okay. And you didn't specifically mention global warming. Is it because the pollution that's what you mean?
So Boardman is also the largest source of climate pollution in the state, single largest source.
So making it go away is a big deal?
It is a big deal. I think it's a signal that this large source of climate pollution is retiring and that it's being replaced, ideally, hopefully, with clean energy resources and storage. That is both better for our health and the climate, and the economics for the customers is a huge step, and we need to be replicating that around the country.
What about, and I wasn't planning to ask you this, but as we were talking, I was thinking about those workers, I wonder if somebody at home is saying, well, gee, the environmental groups kind of helped push this, to a closure, and shouldn't they be footing part of the bill of the worker retraining or taking care of those workers? That's kind of what was behind that question.
Yeah, the worker, I mean, I'd like to say more about that, I guess, if we like. I think there's a lot of different ways that we can be addressing, again, accounting for what happens with communities and workers when the power plants retire. And I think that economy and ecology can and should coexist. And to me, there's an importance around planfulness with it, where we need to be looking ahead so that there isn't this change happening overnight, and the change shouldn't happen overnight.
But are you guys jumping in and saying, okay, City of Boardman, let us help you plan for it, and these are some of the things that we can bring to the table?
I think we'd be happy to be a part of the conversation around what the future could be and where and how we might be able to help contribute to that. We're not economic development experts, and I think we need to be, invited in for those conversations as opposed to defining what it is that workers could or should be doing. We can certainly put options on the table. We have examples and case studies of other places where we've been a part of that conversation where we could contribute to that, but ultimately it's not for us to define, and hopefully we can find ways together that will account for some of that adaptation. And we recognize that it is going to be a big change and a hard change, and there's no way around that. But we hope that we can be in dialogue, and if there's ways that we can be supportive in some way, we'd like to see where we might be able to come together around that.